They said the horse would kill anyone who stepped inside that ring, but when a quiet boy walked in without a rope, something no one could explain began to happen. The crowd came for a spectacle of control, but what they witnessed instead was something far more unsettling, because for the first time, the horse wasn't fighting, and neither was the boy. The man hit the dirt hard, too hard for anyone to laugh right away. Dust rose in a dry cloud around him as the gray stallion wheeled away, hooves striking the ground like cracks of thunder. For a brief second, the entire training yard froze. Then the murmurs came. Low, uneasy, the kind that follows something people pretend is still entertainment. Ashen Vow stood at the far end of the enclosure, sides heaving, ears pinned flat. The wind swept across the high plateau, carrying the scent of cold grass and iron. There was nothing wild or careless in the way the horse moved. Every step was sharp, deliberate. Not chaos, resistance. Up on the wooden platform, Calvin Rhodes leaned against the rail, one hand resting casually on the polished head of his cane. His expression didn't change much, even as two men hurried to pull the fallen rider away. He had seen this too many times already. The spectacle had lost its novelty. Only the result mattered. "No one stays on him," Calvin said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. His voice carried easily in the open air. "Not for 10 seconds. Not for 5. A few men shifted their weight. Others avoided looking at the horse entirely. Ashen Vow pawed at the dirt again, muscles tightening beneath his storm-gray coat. The fading sunlight caught along his back, turning him into something almost sculpted, beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable. "He's not built to be ridden," someone muttered near the fence. Calvin smirked faintly. "Everything is," he replied, "if you know how." But no one stepped forward. The wind moved through the yard again, rattling the loose edges of the metal fencing. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked, the kind of small sound people would usually ignore. But not today. Today, every silence felt heavier than it should. That was when the boy appeared. He hadn't been near the front before. No one had noticed him during the earlier attempts. He stood now at the edge of the crowd, hands resting loosely at his sides, clothes worn but clean, dusty boots, a faded jacket, sleeves rolled just enough to show he was used to work. He didn't look at the men. He looked at the horse. Calvin noticed him almost immediately. "You planning on trying your luck?" he called out, a trace of amusement slipping into his tone. The boy didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on Ashen Vow, watching the rise and fall of the animal's chest, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hooves never quite settled in one place. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not here to ride him." A few scattered laughs broke out, thin and uncertain. Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Then you're in the wrong place." The boy stepped closer to the fence, close enough now that the horse turned his head slightly in his direction. Not aggressive, just aware. "I don't think he's fighting riders," the boy said quietly. "I think he's fighting being kept." The words didn't land like a challenge. They landed like something people weren't sure how to argue with. Calvin's smile thinned. "And what would you suggest instead?" The boy glanced along the perimeter of the enclosure. The reinforced rails, the tension wires humming faintly in the wind, the invisible boundary that had held the horse in place all day. Then he said it. "Take it down." The laughter came louder this time, but it didn't last. "Take what down?" Calvin asked, though he already knew. "The fence," the boy replied. His voice stayed calm, steady. "All of it?" A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone cursed under their breath. Another shook his head. "That's not training," a man said. "That's losing him." The boy finally turned his gaze toward Calvin. There was no defiance in his eyes, just something steady, something certain. "He's already lost," he said. The wind picked up, pushing a long wave through the dry grass beyond the enclosure. For a moment, no one spoke. Calvin studied the boy more carefully now, as if trying to place something he couldn't quite name. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eli." "Eli," Calvin repeated slowly. Then he looked back at the horse. "You really think tearing down that fence is going to change anything?" Eli followed his gaze. Ash and Val had gone still again, watching them both now, dark eyes sharp, unblinking. "It won't change him," Eli said. A pause. "It'll just give him a chance to decide." That was the moment the air shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that even the men who had been laughing before now stood a little quieter, their attention pulled in whether they wanted it or not. Calvin tapped his cane once against the wood, and for the first time that afternoon, he didn't dismiss the idea. Calvin gave the order with the reluctance of a man signing away something he still believed he owned. The ranch hands moved slowly, exchanging doubtful glances as they unhooked the charged lines and dragged the portable panels aside. Metal scraped over dirt. Posts came loose one by one. The narrow training ring opened into the wider field beyond it, and the evening wind rushed through the gap as if it had been waiting all day. No one spoke to Eli. No one trusted what he was asking, but no one stopped him either. Ash and Val sensed the change before the work was even finished. The gray stallion lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed on the widening break where Steele had stood a moment earlier. The last panel came free. One ranch hand stumbled backward. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. Then the horse moved. He shot forward so suddenly the crowd recoiled as one body. Dirt burst behind him. His mane lashed in the wind. For an instant it looked as though the whole valley had been split open and something powerful had finally broken through. Men near the fence shouted, some in warning, some in disbelief. Calvin stepped down from the platform, jaw set hard, watching the stallion race into the open grass. But Ashen Vow did not keep going. Halfway across the field, he faltered. His pace broke. The wild line of his body turned uncertain. He veered sharply, then again, circling without direction, hooves tearing dark scars through the pale ground. The freedom in front of him was endless, yet he moved like a creature that had reached the edge of one fear only to fall into another. He tossed his head, struck at the air, spun so fast his hindquarters slipped in the dust. The crowd grew quiet. It was not rage they were seeing now, not defiance. It was something rawer than that. An animal with no wall left to fight, no corner left to brace against, and no idea what to do with the emptiness around him. Calvin stared out at the field, confusion beginning to replace his certainty. "Why doesn't he run?" he asked, but no one answered. Eli had already stepped away from the others. He did not chase the horse. He did not call to him. He walked into the open pasture at an angle, slow and unthreatening, until he reached a patch of wind-bent grass well away from the stallion's path. Then, with the whole ranch watching, he lowered himself to the ground, not kneeling, not preparing to spring, just sitting. His elbows rested loosely on his knees. His gaze stayed low, not fixed on the horse, not demanding. The gesture was so quiet, so stripped of performance, that it unsettled the men at the fence more than any stunt would have. Ashen Vow kept circling at first. Then the circles widened. His breathing carried across the field in broken bursts. The sky above the plateau deepened toward amber and blue, and in that enormous silence the horse began to notice the one living thing that was not asking anything from him. Eli remained still. When he finally spoke, his voice did not travel far. It barely rose above the grass. "You don't have to be cornered anymore." The stallion slowed. Not much. Just enough that the shift could be felt before it was fully seen. Behind them the ranch stood suspended in the last thin light of day, and every eye turned toward the open field where fear, for the first time, had nowhere left to hide. The stallion's circling broke apart little by little, as though the force driving him had begun to lose its shape. Ashen Vow no longer cut frantic loops through the grass. He drifted into wider turns, then slower ones, until at last he stood with his chest heaving and his head lifted toward the young man seated several yards away. The wind moved over the field in long, silver currents, flattening the grass and raising it again. But Eli did not rise with it. He stayed exactly where he was, small against the open land, offering nothing but stillness. From the ranch yard, that stillness began to feel stranger than violence. The men at the fence had expected another spectacle, one more burst of struggle they could understand. What they were seeing instead asked something harder of them. It required patience. It required silence. Even Calvin Rhodes, who had built his life on action and outcome, found himself gripping his cane without realizing he had stopped speaking. Ashen Vow took one step forward. Not the explosive charge of a cornered animal, not a warning strike. Just one careful step, then another, his ears turning toward Eli and away again, as though he still did not trust what the field was telling him. Dust clung darkly around his lower legs. His breathing remained rough, but the edge had changed. He no longer looked like a creature trying to escape. He looked like one trying to understand. Eli kept his eyes lowered toward the grass between them. He knew better than to reach across the distance too quickly. Some wounds were made worse by hope arriving too fast. So he gave the horse the one thing no one else had thought to give him: room to arrive in his own time. "You can stop proving it," Eli said softly. The words floated out and disappeared into the wind, but Ashen Vow heard something in the tone. His head lowered an inch, then another. He came forward in uneven steps, pausing often, testing the silence for hidden pressure. Each time he stopped, Eli remained motionless. Each time the horse looked for pursuit, there was none. By the time Ashen Vow reached him, the field itself seemed to be holding its breath. He did not touch the boy at first. He stood just behind Eli's shoulder, close enough that the warmth of his body gathered in the cooling air, close enough that Eli could hear the deep, unsettled rhythm still working through the stallion's chest. A shiver passed through the horse's flank. Eli did not turn. He did not reward the moment with sudden affection. He simply stayed there, allowing the nearness to exist without claiming it. That was when the crowd finally understood they were witnessing something no saddle could create. Calvin stepped forward once, then stopped himself. The old habit of intervening rose in him like reflex, but even he could see that one wrong sound might shatter the fragile bridge forming out there in the grass. At length, Eli planted one hand on the ground and stood, slowly enough not to startle the animal. He brushed the dust from his palms and turned not toward the stallion, but toward the path leading back to the yard. The move startled a murmur from the fence line. "He's leaving?" someone whispered. Eli took a step. Ashen Vow stayed. Then Eli took another. A beat later, the stallion moved too. No one had tied a lead rope to his halter. No one had laid a hand on his neck. Yet he followed with the measured caution of a creature making a decision it did not fully understand, only feel. Eli did not look back to check. He trusted the sound of hoofbeats behind him, soft now, almost thoughtful. Together they crossed the open stretch between field and ranch, the boy in front, the gray stallion behind, like two survivors walking out of different kinds of storms. By the time they reached the edge of the yard, every man there had gone silent. No one rushed to meet them. The yard, so loud only an hour before, had fallen into the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel important. The scrape of Eli's boot across packed earth, the soft exhale from Ashen Vow's nostrils, the restless creak of a loose sign swinging near the barn. Men who had laughed at the boy now stood with their hands hanging uselessly at their sides, as if they had misplaced the old language of pride and wagers. Eli stopped near the place where the training ring had once stood. He did not turn at once. He let the stallion choose the last few steps for himself. Ashen Vow came forward until his shoulder nearly aligned with Eli's back, then paused there, neither trapped nor drifting away. In the fading light, his storm-gray coat seemed to gather the color of the sky itself. Calvin Rhodes descended from the platform more slowly than before. For the first time that day, he did not look like a man presenting a challenge. He looked like a man approaching an answer he had not wanted. "You never rode him," he said at last. His voice carried, but without performance now. Eli turned slightly. "No, sir." A few men along the outer fence shifted, waiting for the argument they thought should follow. The wager had been simple. Everyone understood rules when they promised a clear winner and a clear loser. But what stood before them had slipped beyond the neat edges of that bargain. Calvin looked from the boy to the horse. "Then by the terms of it," he said, "you didn't win." Eli nodded once, calm as ever. "I know." That answer unsettled Calvin more than defiance would have. There was no pleading in it, no disappointment. The boy had not come for the money. That truth stood in the yard as plainly as the horse beside him. The older man took another step forward. "Most people would have tried to claim something anyway." Eli reached out then, not to seize the horse, only to let his fingers rest briefly against the thick line of Ashen Vow's neck. "Most people were trying to get something from him," he said. "I wasn't." The wind moved through the dismantled posts lying in the dirt, making them knock softly together. Calvin followed the sound with his eyes, then looked out toward the open pasture beyond the yard. The space seemed different now, larger, quieter, stripped of the certainty he had arranged around it. "I paid a great deal for that horse," he said, almost to himself. "Brought in trainers, specialists, men who promised results." Ashen Vow flicked an ear, but stayed where he was. Calvin let out a thin breath. "And all that time, he never stood next to me the way he stands next to you." Eli did not answer immediately. Some truths sounded smaller once spoken aloud. After a moment, he said, "You kept asking him to forget what he was." The sentence landed harder than accusation. Calvin lowered his gaze to the disturbed ground at his feet. The hoof marks, the dragged rails, the evidence of a long day spent forcing the wrong question. Around him, his ranch hands said nothing. Even they seemed to understand this was no longer about a horse that could not be ridden. At length, Calvin lifted his head. "If I told you to take him," he said, "would you?" Eli looked toward the darkening field, then back to the stallion. "No." That drew a murmur from somewhere near the barn, but Eli went on. "He shouldn't belong to me either." For the first time, something like a weary smile touched Calvin's face. It was not the smile of a man pleased with himself. It was the smaller, sadder kind that comes when pride finally loosens its grip. He turned to the nearest ranch hand and nodded toward the dismantled barrier. "Leave it open," he said. The man blinked. "All night?" "All night," Calvin repeated. Then he faced the pasture once more, speaking more quietly than anyone had heard him speak that day. "If he wants the hills, let him have them." Eli stepped back from the stallion and lowered his hand. Nothing held Ashen Vow now. The field lay open in front of him, silvered by the first rise of evening. For a long moment, the horse only stood there, ears forward, listening to the wind move over the grass. Then he walked out past the broken line where the ring had been, and into the wide, darkening land beyond. No one called after him. The men remained where they were, watching the gray shape move farther into the dusk until it nearly disappeared. The high country took him in without a sound. One by one, people began to drift away toward their trucks and the bunkhouse, speaking softly, as if unwilling to disturb whatever had just been set right. Eli stayed. He stood with his hands at his sides, gaze fixed on the pasture, not waiting in hope, not bracing for loss. Simply letting the moment be what it was. Minutes passed, perhaps more. Then, out beyond the reach of the yard lights, movement stirred again. Ashen Vow emerged from the grass and came back at an easy walk. Unhurried, certain, the long line of his body calm beneath the stars beginning to gather overhead. He crossed the open ground, came through the place where the barrier had been, and stopped beside Eli as though returning to a place he had chosen, not a place he had been made to stay. Calvin watched from near the barn, his cane resting loose in one hand. "Well," he said softly, almost with wonder, "I suppose that settles it." Eli laid his palm against the horse's neck only for a moment, then let it fall away again. He understood now what the others were only beginning to learn, that trust was never something you won. It was something that arrived on its own feet after fear had been given room to breathe and leave. Above them, the night spread slowly across the plateau. The pasture remained open, the gate remained open, and the horse stayed there not because anyone had finally broken him, but because for the first time in a long while, no one was trying to. Not everything can be won by force, and not everything is meant to be owned. Sometimes trust only comes when we stop trying to control and start learning to understand. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting. Quiet, human, and worth hearing.
If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more meaningful stories like this.